Montoya Smith, aka Black Socrates. All I ask is that you think.
What's up, everybody? It's your boy Montoya Smith, aka Black Socrates, Black with another edition of the Just My 3 Cents podcast, rapid fire live interactive podcast where you can jump on and join me. I have a unique show I'm attempting to do today. It's a different promotion for what you're used to seeing, but I basically wanted to bring in a sports analogy to discuss our lack of nuance and dialogue in public discourse and how it's affecting our society. So I thought it would be an interesting way to jump into some dialogue, and hopefully you guys would jump on with me. But it's not just a sports show, and really when I promoted it just for a couple of days, I didn't really get a lot of hits on it because it probably looked pretty weird as I promoted this Bird versus Magic and the lack of public discourse. Bird versus Magic and the lack of public discourse. So I was really contemplating, should I put Jordan versus LeBron, would that have gotten more eyes? But not attempting to pull bait and switch, if you will. But I wanted to use a sports analogy again to get into our lack of public discourse and how it truly affects society and the role that social media is playing in that. So I hope to have a very interesting discussion. Hope some of you would jump in and join me as I, in a sense, set this show up with the sports analogy. And not to have you waiting too long, let me jump right into it. I'm a 70s baby or whatever, grew up when the NBA started blowing up, if you will, in the early 80s, right after Magic and Bird had at the time. I don't know if it still is, but it was the most watched college championship when Magic Johnson at Michigan State played against Larry Bird at Indiana State University, if I'm correct, in '79. That was the most watched. I wasn't watching that. I'm old enough. I didn't watch that, if you will. But shortly thereafter, I became a basketball fan, actually a Michael Jordan, North Carolina fan in college, if you will. And then that led me into watching NBA basketball, which was getting, in a sense, reviving itself from a difficult period as Magic and Bird stormed the league, if you will, right? So Magic goes to the Lakers. Bird ends up going to the Boston Celtics, two-storied franchise in the NBA, pillars of the NBA, and them coming into the NBA pretty much set out the resurgence of the NBA. From what I understand, I always talk about this on sports shows, that the NBA Finals was actually watched on delay, if you will. And so Magic and Bird coming into the league, people got eyes watching again, and there's the current show, Winning Time currently, so those that may have caught that or whatever. But just highlighting their ascension into the NBA, and for the next decade, it was almost as if Magic and Bird, if you will, either was in the championship or playing against each other. But Magic ended up winning 5 championships. Bird ended up winning 3 championships with the Boston Celtics in the 80s, if you will. So they ruled the 80s. And so what led me to using that back and forth, because at that time I would see all the older guys go back and forth about who they like. And in reality, let's be honest, at that time, it was kind of like if you were black, you probably like Magic, and if you were white, maybe you like Bird. That was kind of the racial, if you will, demographics of the time, with Boston versus Magic or whatever. Boston versus the Celtics was kind of a black and white dynamic when you look at the history. And at that time, that's pretty much where you sided. And so people would have these dialogue about who was better, and they would go back and forth with championships, MVPs. So that was the dialogue. What prompted me to do this show was another sports dialogue I was recently privy to. And I wanted to talk about the difference of how those dialogues will take place versus the Bird versus Magic, what took place just recently. And it really gets into the mindset and the shift in how we're capable of having public discourse. After I give this sports analogy and setup, we'll get into how it affects our discourse, the reality of what I saw in the difference in how the Bird versus Magic disc battle, dialogue, who was better back then, how that was had versus how I see sports dialogues, how they happen right now. So hopefully y'all can bear with me, follow the logic, and then we'll jump into how it affects what we typically talk about on the show: race, sex, and culture. I got a friend in the background, Latrice. I'm gonna leave you sitting in the background until I get around to the part that particularly involves you, if you will. So to set up this background, again, Bird versus Magic, all-time argument. People still can make that argument, but now everybody makes the LeBron versus Jordan, or the Jordan versus Kobe, or the Kobe versus LeBron. But I was privy to a Clubhouse. I don't get on it too often. Sometimes I'll jump on there real quick on the sports one just to blow some steam. And I was on this brother who goes by the name of Timeless. I was on his page, or Clubhouse, if you will, and they got into a dialogue about who was better between Shaquille O'Neal and Hakeem Olajuwon. When they asked me that question, I said, "Oh, I got overall, overall or all time, I think I have them fourth, and fifth on my all-time list." Behind Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell, and then I would put Shaq, and then Olajuwon. I said, so I'm a Laker fan, so I put Shaq ahead, if you will. And I said, but in reality, between those two, if you make an argument for Olajuwon or you make an argument for Shaquille, either way, you're going to be about right. They're pretty close to each other. Now, on this particular Clubhouse, there was a big divide. There was an older guy who was real big time, Hakeem Olajuwon, and a younger guy that was a big time Shaq, and they were having this argument over who had the better career. So as that dialogue kind of played out and looked at all their backgrounds, it was kind of like, okay, again, I said you could lean either way, overall career, and they kind of stayed in their extremes. Then the subject changed to prime Shaq versus prime Olajuwon. And I said, well, when you change it to that nuance, then I'll take Shaq against anybody ever at center. Over Kareem, over Russell, over Wilt Chamberlain, prime Shaq against any of them, he's smashing. So I say this, but the guy who was actually running the Clubhouse, when we were having the overall career discussion, I want to watch this nuance. It's going to start making sense in a second. So when we were having the dialogue about who had the overall career, and some were deciding Olajuwon and some were calling Shaq, the guy who was running the actual page said, hey, even when Olajuwon, for those who know, when Shaq first went to the finals, we played against Olajuwon, the Houston Rockets against Orlando Magic, and they ended up beating them 4-0. They swept Shaq and them, right? And so the guy that was arguing for Olajuwon, obviously was pointing it out that he was better than Shaquille, and he made him look bad and all that kind of stuff. Well, Shaquille even admitted to in his career that was the time when he got schooled the most, if you will. But the guy running the page, while we were making that dialogue about the overall career, goes, well, even a baby Shaq still played very well, even though his team lost 0-4, he played very well. He made that statement. So then when the young guy changes it to prime Shaq versus Olajuwon, and I'm saying, yeah, I'll take that Shaq, that same guy who had made the argument that baby Shaq had done well, even though his team lost, now is struggling with this position. Like, he literally says the opposite of what he had said. And I was like, well, you were the one that pointed out that he had done well even though his team lost. So it should be pretty easy to decide now that Shaq prime versus Olajuwon prime, Shaq was better. Again, work with me. But the older guy, here's where it makes sense, and then we're going to jump into race, sex, and culture. So the older guy who continued to make the argument for Olajuwon the entire time. Again, he had a very valid argument for who was better career-wise against the young guy. Again, you can go either way. But when we change it to prime versus prime, the guy digs up an article. He digs up this article, and in the article, now he uses this article for his case. Now we're just pay attention to the nuance. We're arguing the prime at Shaq at his best years, which was like late 90s when he was winning 3 championships with the Lakers, versus a prime Olajuwon. He pulls up this article, and he's using this in his favor. He reads this article that highlights, had Shaq had a better work ethic, had he been as professional as Olajuwon, which he loved that point, that this article was pointing out how professional Olajuwon was. He's an older guy, so it makes sense, and how he worked hard. So he really appreciated it. Now he thinks he's making the case for Olajuwon, and the article says, but had Shaq had that type of work ethic, he would have been the best player, not just the best center, but the best player of all time. So I'm listening to this dialogue, and I say to the older man, again, it's just a fun sports dialogue. This doesn't really matter, right? I said, based on the fact that we're going prime against prime, you do realize that article doesn't help you. And he was like, no, Elijah Warren was this. And I says, that article helps you if you want to make a career argument. But right now we're having a nuance of prime against prime. And this article is basically telling you that with that same work ethic, there's absolutely no way anybody could have come close to Shaq. So I'm highlighting this dialogue because he's bringing this to the table without even realizing that it actually hurts him. And here's what I'm talking about when it comes to discourse. Discourse in this sense. So even in a sports analogy, you become unaware of when something is in your favor or against you because you're so stuck in how you see things. Another prime example, this so happened to come up on SportsCenter today. I was going to bring this up anyway. But for those of y'all who know Stephen A. Smith, right? He talks about how LeBron's root and Rich Paul, if y'all know, LeBron made his friends, all rich by, helping him with his career. Rich Paul is his agent. But he talked about a couple of years ago, he talked about it again today. I was going to talk about this anyway, so it's funny to see it on ESPN today. But he talked about this maybe a year ago, a couple of years ago on the Gilbert Arenas broadcast, where Stephen A. says that Michael Jordan is the number one all time. For him, at this point, LeBron James cannot pass him. So in having that dialogue, he says that with him being the number one broadcaster in sports, Rich Paul and LeBron will never come on his show, will never talk to him. And he makes a great point. He goes, I think LeBron is the second greatest player of all time. He's the second greatest player of all time, only below Michael Jeffrey Jordan, and Skip Bayless always loves to say, only behind him. And he says, you would think to Rich Paul and LeBron James, I made him the worst player ever. And this is how this matters. And now we're switching it. So he's saying they think I'm being disrespectful by rating him second, to the point where they will not even have a conversation with Stephen A. Stephen A. has said, I make my case. I would gladly have LeBron or Rich Paul or anybody in his crew come on to make their case. This is just a sports dialogue. This doesn't even matter. And they won't even have the conversation. That is the echo chambers that we have moved to when you start talking about more important issues of race, sex, and culture. We have an inability to have dialogue when someone differs, regardless of why. Now, we bring full circle and we're moving into this thing. So what made me think of this show, The Magic versus Bird, is I remember when I was younger and would get involved in those dialogues, and I was a Magic fan, so I would make the Magic versus Bird thing. But when I was arguing with, back then when I was young, when I would make a disagreement with or have an argument about Bird, and Bird, somebody from the Bird side, if you will, would bring up a valid stat, I would have to go in my brain and think of, okay, let me think of something something that Magic does to either improve or make Magic seem like he's better than Bird. But what was happening was I would have to consider the stat and try to come up with something better to make my hypothetical argument. What happens today when, for example, I'm a Kobe fan, but I'll make a objective argument about how amazing LeBron James is. Kobe is my favorite player of all time, but I still objectively rank LBJ above him. So what happens is, but when I dialogue with people who do not like LeBron James, they don't consider a valid, something that's objective, the number of MVPs. They'll point something out. And when you point out something good about LeBron James, what happens today is they will dismiss it. They will dismiss it completely and not even consider it. And that's how dialogue happens today. So now, for example, when we move into a conversation, here's something that happened recently. I'm going to show you how this applies to today. So if you've been following my analogy, the difference in dialogue today, even in something that does not matter, such as a sports analogy, a dialogue, you can't even bring a quote unquote or a stat or something that you want to say about a player. And if the person does not like that player, them not liking them will disregard any objectivity to that player's accomplishment. They might say, oh, he didn't earn that MVP, even though he has an MVP on their record. I'm just saying, for example, that's how dialogue happens when we talk about race, sex, and culture. And the difference is it matters. It matters. It's our inability to have public discourse and consider different facts, if you will, as a thought process to figure out, okay, how am I going to see this? Well, when we struggle with dialogue on things that matter, it actually bleeds into policy that affects our country specifically, but this happens all around the world. If you understand dialogue and the importance of public discourse and the role that it is played throughout human history to develop societies and culture, we cannot be in a place where we have echo chambers where just because I dislike a person, I can't hear anything they say, or once they say one thing that's triggering, I no longer can listen to them. I'll give you a quick example of what I'm talking about. Obviously, we're coming into the tail end of this pandemic, if you will, maybe becoming an endemic here. I don't know if anybody, I just saw a headline, unfortunately, the deaths are increasing again, believe it or not. Not to be fear-mongered or whatever, but I just want to use this example. And so for those who know, during the pandemic, if you will, I was personally an advocate for getting the vaccines, before that. I'm going to go ahead and bring my man William on. Latrice, I'm going to let you jump on here as well, Queen. Just in case y'all want to get in and start talking with me, because I don't mind y'all dialoguing. For those that don't know or just watching, hit the clip. If you want to join like William, like Latrice, all you have to do is hit the link. I don't have it on my Facebook page today. Sorry, I got it on my Mental Dialogue Facebook page, but not my personal Facebook page. But I also have it in YouTube. So you have to jump on with me as well. But anyway, I want to give this quick example, and I'll let y'all jump on with me, because I want to transition out of the sports analogy now, if y'all been following me so far. And so just a quick example, again, I've been an advocate for the vaccines or whatever, and over the last, if you will, the last year or so, less conversations about it, because again, we're coming out of it. As I said years ago, as I pointed out years ago, as scientists, in a sense, catch up to this virus, eventually we will return to normal. But the big dialogue 3 years ago was, were they putting in these different mandates, if you will, and going to make them permanent and in a sense create a new world order. That was some of the dialogues that was happening 3 years ago. And I remember one of my friends, I said to him, well, at this point, because 3 years ago, I said, neither one of us knows if we're right. I think this is just what scientists typically do when a virus becomes pandemic. It's our first worldwide pandemic in 100 years. So I just think all of these things are typical scientific health initiatives that always happen. That was my take. His take is, no, they've been setting us up for a thing. And I say, hey, it's going to take 2 or 3 years before either one of us know if we're right. I would offer that I'm right at this point, because things are lessening up as science has caught up to this virus, if you will. That's what I would offer. But another friend in that same dialogue said this, and this will make one of the points tonight, and I want to hear what William has to say as well. So one thing that happened was, now we're at the tail end. Over the last 2 years, we've had an additional 900,000 deaths, higher than what we've had in previous years. That's just on total deaths. That's just a total deaths. And I was in a dialogue about 4 or 5 months ago with someone who was still highlighting how they misnamed a certain death, saying that all the deaths that they called COVID were not actually deaths. And so this stat was just being shown. And in that dialogue, I say to him, I said, I understand, and I'm not saying everything is recorded accurately, but I threw out, I said, hey, but now I have this total deaths and the increase over the past 2 years. And I just simply offered, I said, well, what do you have to say to that? And if you're following me, this number mattered in this dialogue, because his suggestion was that they've been mislabeling this. He still call it the pandemic and all this type of things. And I was just offering, but do you realize there's been 900,000 more deaths over the past 2 years, regardless of what you label those deaths? The only thing that's been different in the last 2 years is COVID. That's just a simple logic once you know that stat. He didn't have anything to say. And another friend who prides himself in being more logical than anybody, he got caught up in his own political ideology. And his response to me was simply, that's not true. Didn't take the time to look it up. Didn't take the time to ask me where I got it from. Plus, he knows enough about me. I would have gladly showed it to him. But he just simply said it was not true. The friend that I'm talking about, is not about whether anybody that's watching me is listening or agreeing with me, but he had to go, it's not true, in order to not even consider this new information that he had never known. So in order to not have dialogue with me, he had to dismiss this actual fact in order to maintain his ideology. That's how we get in echo chambers. This brother right here, me and William, we go back and forth. We don't agree on this pandemic, hardly on anything. But one thing, right? But what we will do is consider the facts and address it based on a new fact. If he presents me some new information, I don't just say he's wrong. He'll challenge me, and he know I'll go say, hey, here's where this came from, to be able to have a dialogue, because I don't know the information, even though he and I disagree. I do not assume his information is wrong. Plus, I respect the brother enough to know he's not just randomly throwing out there. He may have just came across his information. He ain't got time to look it up. He know my ass do. So that's something how they go. The dialogue is always true, because at the end of the day, if me and him are about each other, I'm using this example, but I see when you start making these things political, I've seen people lose friendships over a difference just because somebody brought something actual to the table, but it was not considered because of a different ideology. So my bigger point today in using the sports analogy and how people can't even dialogue and give credit to, if you hate LeBron, his stat, if you hate Kobe, can't even give credit to a stat that might actually say, oh, I need to at least consider it. We don't even consider no more. We dismiss. Your thoughts, King?
I think the sports analogy was brilliant and bringing this this point of and it puts me in the mind of the Great Debaters. I don't know, the Denzel movie, right? The Great Debaters, because in that movie, what you learn, and this is what we got to get back to. We got to get back to the fundamentals. It's almost like sports. It's funny that you use the analogy of sports, because in sports, I was having this conversation the other day. Like, people think that it's all athletic ability a lot of times, just using sports as the analogy again, when in reality, it's a high level of fundamental that actually gets you the championship. And so I was having this conversation with my cousin the other day, because I was talking about the difference between the professional game and the and just pickup ball or college. And the biggest difference in that people don't tune into is the shot clock, right? Because I was telling him, I was like, by the time you get past half court, you really only have 15 seconds to get into a play and get the best shot you can get. Right. And what I've seen with that is the best athletes in the world sometimes cannot adjust to that fundamental of, if I got the ball, somebody hit me with the ball and there's 2 seconds on the clock out of 15 seconds, I got to create a shot. And a lot of people are uncomfortable with that, no matter how good they are athletically. And so the reason why I use that analogy is because it's kind of the same thing in trying to connect the sports analogy. It's like, you have to understand how to argue your point where people are actually going to receive what you're saying, versus just going back and forth with these skills that you think you have, but you're missing the fundamentals of arguing the point. And if you don't practice, or if you don't exercise the fundamentals of communication, there's fundamentals with communication, believe it or not. And the problem is, we aren't taught these fundamentals. Like, how is it best? Like the analogy you use with us, like the example you use with us, we hear each other. So when I speak, you hear me. When you speak, I hear you. That's the biggest move forward than anything. And no matter what you say, is, are you listening to each other, and are you receiving what the other person is saying? So you have to get, and some of it goes to this buzzword that is big right now called emotional intelligence. Right. The problem a lot of times is a lot of us have very low emotional intelligence. Very little. Yes. So
and we're passing it off as okay. We're actually finding others who are just as emotionally low in intelligence as us to prove that we're right. We just want numbers. Right. We just want numbers. And these numbers are now seeping into our laws. Right. This is just normal.
We mistaken it as passion, and passion has its place. Like, passion has its place, because passion can be the driver sometimes to get you over the obstacle, right? Because sometimes you need that passion to get you past this obstacle where you've done everything, and the only thing that's going to get you to the next level is sheer will of passion, right? But that's not the most effective way to state case and prove point that you're trying to make. Passion will actually block you if it's not used correctly. And so we mistake this lack of emotional intelligence with passion, because what we don't allow is the dialogue to actually be fulfilled, right? Where like I'm stating my case, I'm stating my points, right? You're stating your case, you're stating your points. We both understand facts. We both understand each other's point of views, which have to be logic also, right? And then we go, okay, now let's dialogue about that. And there's no, I think it's just the emotional intelligence or lack of is the biggest thing. And I'll tell you how I actually deal with this. People don't, because like with my daughter, I use my daughter a lot in terms of how I actually bring her into emotional intelligence. Because a lot of times in the Black community, we view certain things as bad, like gambling, right? So we'll say, oh, gambling's bad. But gambling, and I'm an investor. I like to invest. So there's a very thin line between gambling and investing, right? And in some senses, it's exactly the same. You know what I mean? Go ahead.
Risk assessment.
Oh yeah. Risk assessment.
Yeah, so we put just the connotation of gambling versus risk assessment.
Exactly.
They're the same thing, but it sounds better.
Exactly.
And you want her to understand gambling from a risk assessment standpoint.
Yes.
Because a lot of what we enjoy today, technology-wise, and the advancements of technology, from people who make calculated risk assessments, which is no different than gambling to it.
Exactly. And you have to have, and this is what I teach her, like in that risk assessment of investment, you're going to have wins and you're going to have losses. What you can't do is you have to check your emotional intelligence.
Right.
Because if you get caught up in the emotion of the decision you're making in regards to the data you're presenting or what's presented to you, you'll lose all the time, right? So it's these fun. So that's part of the fundamentals that I talk about. We have to start teaching our children the fundamentals of decision making, which requires risk and emotional intelligence, and that will carry over to what you're talking about, which is learning how to not get emotional when you're debating about a subject that is that's not a fact, right? It's subjective, right? It's an opinion, but you're getting so emotional in an opinion that you can't even
facts that can move dialogue along. So
exactly.
Let me give an example of how this really matters. So, for example, I guess maybe been a month or so ago, but you remember like the woman swimmer, the transgender swimmer that won the whatever. And so I would challenge that it's our lack of public discourse that gets us to a day like that. It's not the first time it's happened, but I know it was highlighted here recently, right? So here's my take and why I wanted to do this show again. It's the lack of being able to have nuance dialogue, because doing it the way we're currently doing with a low level of emotional intelligence, thanks for bringing that word in, but doing our dialogue with the low level of emotional intelligence, we end up trying to basically drown out dialogue because you have a position.
Happens every time. Yeah.
And so in my opinion, I'm just going to use a broad leap, my own personal leap for how we get to, for example, a transgender swimmer winning a swimming competition. So what happens is, because we're not incapable of having dialogue, equality is obviously, especially us as African American, is a huge buzzword throughout the history of this, right? And so our movements, things that our movement, in a sense, the African American movement done in the past, a lot of groups have, in a sense, adopted aspects of that movement, right, to kind of push their cause forward for getting seen and respected in the country, right? So beautiful. Adopt whatever it takes to win, if you will. But if you think about, funny that you brought up Great Debaters, but if you really think about, as good as the movie was, what they ultimately were doing, they were playing their role in public discourse to move to advance our position as African Americans. Those great debaters, maybe they wasn't on the front line, if you want to call whatever the front lines may have been at that time or whatever, but they played their role. Because there's no actions or no laws of change anywhere around the world that did not start with good public discourse that led to some type of change from that culture or society for whatever reason. But
Right.
if you can't do dialogue and you do yelling at one another from echo chambers, that becomes dangerous and it becomes a mob mentality. And now something will take over that had we been able to do nuance and dialogue, it wouldn't have gotten there. So I would challenge, you don't get to a transgender swimmer if you don't turn equality, in my opinion, into something that it is not. So if you think about, for example, the reason we have a men's and women's sports, going back to our sports analogy, right? That difference outside of co-ed stuff that you might do at the college level, and that's kind of just for fun, even though it's a competition, right? When you start taking down records and paying money to go see people and things of that nature, they split the genders. Why? For fairness. Fairness is a good word that applies to equality, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so, but when you take equality and start applying it to, for example, a transgender who's saying, well, I want to be recognized as a woman, which I have no problem with, right? I have no problem with that they self-identify as a woman or vice versa. A woman wants to identify with a man. I can have the dialogue because I have no problem with a transgender, man or woman, whatever. Like I have no personal problem, but should be able to easily have a dialogue about the unfairness of you entering the woman's sports.
Right.
It's an easy dialogue if public discourse is easily had. But if you have lack of public discourse, you have lack of emotional intelligence, then one side can yell down everyone else. And now you cannot have discourse about what makes sense all the way down. And you probably heard this one to the transgender who just got 2 women pregnant in the prison.
Right.
For the life of me, being a legal studies major, I'm not a lawyer, but I spent a couple years in college studying strictly law or whatever. So for the life of me, I have no way in my mind that I can understand how a legal decision, but again, our laws can be wrong or right based on the lack of public discourse or the good, that's how you get the overturning of, Topeka versus the Board of Education or, all these things, because good discourse can also lead to good policy, right? But I can't think for the life of me. I didn't go look at this case because sometimes I'll go look them up, whatever's public. I didn't choose to look this one up, but for the life of me, I can't understand how, even if they decide we're going to put a transgender in a woman's prison, just from a common sense, without looking at the case, I would like to have enough nuance to say, okay, if we're going to do it, let them at least have had the change, like have went through the actual operation. Yeah. So for those who are pushing for this, to have this happen, they won the actual settlement all the way to the point was we're not even going to wait till the physical change happens. Mm-hmm. And now the joke's on us as a society that there's 2 women pregnant in that woman's prison. I hope what I'm saying is making sense. And to me, it is the lack and the inability of nuance in public discourse that would even lead us to what I would consider something jokes on us as a society to get to the point where, at a minimum, how do you get to a legal decision that says, oh, this is legal and fair to he believes he's a woman, which I don't have a problem with personally. Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to go ahead and do it before the actual sex change.
Right. Yeah.
So if you listen to what I'm saying, it's not about how I feel about personal feelings about a transgender. I have no problem. I literally don't have a problem. I got a problem that our public discourse allows a legal decision to allow a man who has not yet had the sex change to get into the prison. And I will say how we got there, our lack of public discourse, our inability to critically think and have nuanced conversations is my opinion for why we get to a day like that. Your thoughts, Ken?
Well, that's why things seem to be not, and for people who are fundamentally sound, and that's another kind of buzzword that I, and it's funny because that also converts over to the sports analogy, right? Fundamentally sound, right? And so with that being said, what you're saying, what I hear you saying is, listen, I got no problem with the overarching idea of transgender. I got no problem with that. I got no problem with the acceptance of that in society. People can be who they want to be. What I have to understand are the fundamentally sound or not sound things that don't make sense, right? As to what is happening based on that overarching, thing that's okay. But let's talk about the fundamentals of the things that aren't logic that are happening. Because what happens is if we don't have that skill set, like if we don't have the fundamentals, if we don't have the great debaters, the skill sets to debate our points, our objectives, the facts, if we don't have the ability, which I would argue our system is designed to keep us from having that ability, so we don't argue those points correctly. We get overly emotional on everything, and we see what happens at the end based on our over emotion. Emotion doesn't change policy. It doesn't impact policy unless you're going to go to war, right? And most people
but
don't
I
do
would
that.
offer now. Well, I would offer no that it is changing policy. I think we get to these a transgender male where it's completely unfair. Like the word is about equality, but this is completely unfair.
Right.
I think we get here because now you can't even dialogue and says this doesn't make sense without being accused of some type of level of hate.
And that's what I mean by design. The powers that be get what they want due to the lack of your ability to argue the facts fundamentally, right? So whatever happens just by a decision that is made, not by people coming together and making a joint decision. This is what I think it is. This is what it's going to be, because you don't have the ability to have public discourse about this situation anyway. It's the details. It's like you're talking about. It's like fundamentally, how do you even get to the point where you think it's okay that a man who can impregnate women be in the same cell as a woman? That's not logic. And so if you have the ability to identify that, and that's what I see the lack of ability in people to identify logic and then do debate logic. You can't. We have a problem with debating logic, which is why you know what I do. I always go back and I break it all the way down, because I got a daughter that I go, okay, let me understand how I got to communicate this to her so she can be fundamentally sound, right? And so sometimes I'll use things like we'll play Monopoly or we'll gamble, and I use those things to help her make fundamentally sound decisions that she has to debate herself to and make it make sense as to why you're doing that without getting overly emotional, right? Because the emotion is the problem that we have, which is why we end up arguing, we end up yelling at each other. Kevin Samuels, you got so many examples of why we can't debate facts and statistics. Like one thing, not to be on the Kevin Samuels thing, but one thing I will often see him do is he will always bring statistics to the quote unquote debate, right? And then he would use the statistics, but then he's talking to somebody who's overly emotional a lot of times. And so when you bring that, right, that emotion with statistics, which he tried to do, I'm not saying he necessarily presented his information in the right way. He was kind of brutal with it. But at the same time, what he would do is he would bring facts. And then you have facts mixed with emotion. That doesn't get you anywhere, right? So you have to have the ability to come back.
That's why we're having this dialogue, is to recognize that fact. Eddie, you jumped on this thing, brother. Do you want to get in, or are you just sitting there listening? Come off mute if you want to. Latrice, before I even get to the part I asked you to even jump on for, I'm pretty sure you got some thoughts on this, Queen, if you will. We're just open. Anybody can jump on. I call it just my 3 cents, but I really want y'all to jump on and give me your 3 cents like William's doing. So if either of you want to come off and just give a few thoughts about what you're hearing, and before I even jump into this conversation with my Latrice is one of my Queens of Intellect member, and I called her out. I'm about to call her out here in a few seconds. but I don't know if she want to jump in. Eddie, are you just watching? Just come. If you're just watching, you can just let me know you're watching. If you got something you want to say, go ahead and say it right now, King.
Oh, I'm just listening right now. Yeah, I'll jump in when the water is warm, but that's a great conversation, man.
All right, cool. Just checking. I want to make sure. I didn't want to let you. If you want to get in, I want to make sure I let you in. All right. Well, let me move this conversation along, and this is definitely what Latrice will want to jump in. Again, just at the end of the day, this broadcast, if you will, again, our goal is to make it make sense and raise the culture. So for anybody that's listening to this, I hope it's just an idea of what William just talked about, is to be aware of when your emotion is not even allowing you to consider like a stat or a fact, if you will. And I always like to be clear, because people know I love to present stats. But for like William, he knows me very well. Latrice knows me very well. So people that know me very well, as much as I love to go get the information, here's something that people who don't know me don't understand. I know facts. I mean, not facts. I know stats can never present reality. Mm-hmm. because stats is always going to be a sample size, even if it's a huge comprehensive study, if you will, or whatever. Although I value comprehensive studies over smaller studies because obviously you're more accurate because it's more data points, if you will, right? But I highlight that because some people think that I just see a stat and I rock with it, not understanding there's a way to evaluate and validate what's a better stat versus a lesser stat. And sometimes they could just again go by the size of the, a simple way of, it could be other things too, but one factor could be the size of it, right? But if you really get into, like me, I'm into methodology. I want to know that they use sound methodology before I can start running with the stat. But even the stat in itself, I understand, and a lot of people don't realize this, I understand that it's not presenting reality. However, it often is presenting a trend that we can now have public discourse about, or sometimes about which direction would we like to go, or wow, we didn't even realize this was happening, that this thing that was happening, years ago, had we paid attention to this trend, we might have jumped on it. But if you have been given a political narrative, for example, that tells you not to pay attention to this trend, by the time you realize this trend is real, you are already in the shit. You are already in it because a political narrative wouldn't even allow you to consider the data.
Right.
So I just like to highlight that for those who think I overuse stats. I try my best to be objective with them. We can all make mistakes. I can make mistakes. But what should not happen, and if we were better at public discourse, is, okay, well, let me consider this new thing. It could be considered, and then when I remember one. I think one that you and I had. Remember that in the very beginning of Corona, because you admit it. You kind of into conspiracy to a degree. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
You love it, but in the early points, there was a lot going on, right? It was all the 4G stuff and all that kind of stuff. But
100%.
what I give you credit is, even with you being kind of leaning that way, again, just always watching what your mindset is. I'm watching what the powers. What is their overall goal? So you're always, and I always tell people like you are a benefit because somebody like me might never see it coming.
Right.
Or whatever. Because I'm doused in just the data alone, if you will. And so an outside perspective, that's why the dialogue ends up being good, right? If both of us are willing to have dialogue. We could not talk if we were not willing to do that.
Right.
Because we are in different positions of this. But like one example, if you remember that one time when you was talking like, hey, has this vaccine already been around? You were see, the difference with you is you were sincerely asking me.
Yeah, for sure.
And you sent me that information. You was like, hey, I found this. Has this vaccine already been around? And it was like the specifics of it, right?
Right.
Or whatever. My first answer was, I don't know. And I was willing to go, I don't know with you, because unlike discourse today is, most people will try to present it as a gotcha.
Yeah, for sure.
Public discourse.
Yeah.
You were saying, hey, is this something? Because your point to a degree was, if this is something, that might negate some of what you're saying, Montoya, but you sincerely gave it to me as, is this something? You wasn't doing the, I got you.
Right.
And I'm just showing the difference between intelligent discourse versus how that, I know others I've had these dialogue with, they're presenting got yous. And then so for them, when I turn around and say, hey, this is not the case, they're unwilling to even look at my information. The difference with you was, and I'm just using this one example, was I was able to say, hey man, this was a coronavirus vaccine for, I think, guinea quails or something like that, or whatever.
Right.
And you was like, okay, thanks.
Yeah.
That's discourse and dialogue.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? That little small example shows the difference, and again, the ability to have intelligent dialogue. Say, hey, because you presented new information, I had to consider it. But what we do now is you can bring new information, and I could have did like my friend did me with the overall data. Oh, that's not true. Just say it's not true.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a learning process, right? It's like you don't get this way. Like if you weren't raised to understand those fundamentals of public discourse, right, and good debating skills, and staying to topic, and identifying the objective, and making sure that you satisfy the objective. That's all debating skills, right? You don't let the ops, right, get you pulled in emotionally. Like a lot of the strategy is not to get pulled in emotionally. One guy that I like to listen to a lot, who is very good at that, is Michael Dyson. Michael Dyson is he is very persuasive in his points, his facts, his objectives. So by the time you finish listening to him, he's never yelled. he doesn't scream unless he's just trying to be Michael Tyson, like Michael Tyson. But you know, at the end of the day, if he's trying to, he builds a lot of what he says off of, you know, the debating skills. And so I just think we have to, that's what the justice system is based on. If we went in the courtroom, right, and the lawyers were yelling at each other about who was innocent and who was guilty, we come out with nothing. It's a wash, right? So you have to sit there, be quiet, shut the fuck up. You know what I'm saying? Right. And no matter what they present, whether you believe it or not, right, they get their chance to present their data, right? And whether it's false, real, whatever it is, it's the way that you move the discourse to getting the ultimate answer or goal that you're trying to get to, which in the justice system case is innocent and guilty. And so, you know, it's just, and I think the way we get there, man, is we gotta own that fundamental. We got to understand it first, and then we have to be able to.
I mean, it's awareness. Like yes. Instead of just allowing ourselves to get caught up, which is easy to do. And I'm just talking about, you know, with these phones in our hands and the Facebook and the IG, which makes it go worse.
It's all emotion. Yeah.
Yeah, which is how we have dialogues. We had to show that's how you have dialogues about whether a transgender should be able to read children's books in a middle school.
Right.
Like we actually are having those dialogues. Is actually happening.
Right.
Because of our lack of public discourse. And so there's someone, in a sense, there's a group with an agenda that's effectively maneuvering through this lack of emotional intelligence, this lack of discourse, and setting up agendas and policies that are working in their favor, which is what power and groups should do, if you will. But I will say, as a society, there is a downfall when public discourse is unavailable. Now, here's another conversation. This is not even directly related to this conversation, but I think it fits a little bit. And so this past Saturday, we did for those who don't know, every Saturday morning we do the Mental Dialogue talk show on Blog Talk Radio. And this past Saturday, we had a conversation beyond Roe versus Wade, what now? Right? Wow. And the what now is, if this is the new lay of the land, what are we saying to the next generation? Because, you know, our reality for you and I, William, if you will, right, was we grew up in an era where, although our parents, you know, told us to, you know, my mother was on me about having protective sex and not having children. She was on me, and I appreciate her very much for it. You know what I mean? We still grew up in an era where, hey, sometimes you make that mistake. Some of your friends might get an abortion. Whether you however you feel about it, whether you agree or disagree on it or whatever, that was available. There's a very possibility that if Roe v. Wade is actually going to be turned over based on what leaked from the Supreme Court, if that is a new reality, blue states may keep it, red states may, shut it down. And the reality is, for our children, don't mean they're going to go to school in your state. So even if you're good now, they may go somewhere where they're not. And not that none of us are encouraging it, right? None of us are encouraging abortions, if you will. But we want to have a dialogue about what does that look like? What conversation do we need to have now that this is a new reality? Well, in that conversation, we had a great show. My co-host was Latrice. I don't know if she's listening right now. I'll be able to come off or whatever. But anyway, she was my co-host. And throughout the show, she kept saying forced births or whatever. And I remember at one point, maybe about an hour into the show, I remember saying to her, I says, right, you keep calling it forced birth, but I made another point or whatever, right? And so about 3 hours after the show, that term hit me hard. Now, Latrice, hopefully she'll come on and speak for herself. I don't know if she's watching right now. She may just be awake watching, but hopefully. But she's a diversity consultant, very good at what she do, I might add, right? Okay, here she is. I'm going to let her in on this thing. All right, Queen. You ready for this?
I am.
All right, that's not good. I'm going to take these other ones down now that I got you on here live. Hold on one second. All right, cool. Oh, I still got you on one. Let me take one.
Oh, Latrice was like, "Don't come for me, Negro. I ain't going. You don't come."
Look at she going with that face, right? Well, I'm gonna go.
I'm working.
It's hard to hear you, Queen. I don't know what's up.
So it's like
I'm in and out.
Yeah.
Hopefully she'll come back in.
What happened? Yeah. I wanted to hear what she had to say.
Hear her now.
Okay.
Yeah, that's much better.
Yeah, that's better.
Much better. Okay, so let me go ahead and set this up, Latrice. So you kept using this term, right? So about 3 hours after the show was out, I was like, it finally hit me. forced births. And I kept thinking about that because that term, I was like, I wish I had realized this on the show because I would have talked about this on the show. And this is going to be a great opportunity for dialogue right now. So this is going to happen live in 3D.
Where my tea at?
Find out if I even got skills to really
I gotta
do
get my
this.
tea. I gotta get my tea. Hold up.
I'm going to keep going, brother. You got to catch up. So this might be an opportunity to see if we can actually have the discourse I was just talking about. Because I was thinking about, I was like, forced birth. I kept thinking about the term, and I was like, that's some bullshit. That's some BS. Forced birth. And I'm like, she's a diversity consultant, right? So she understands all of this language. She helps out organizations understanding new language and, you know, how to include people. That's what she does for a living. She's amazing at it. I know she's amazing at it. I'll vouch for 100%. But I was thinking about this term forced birth, and I was like, that term is a misnomer. Because I've been talking about abortions all my life, right? And let me give a little history right here. We've had different shows on it. And on one show, I said this. While I personally am not a believer in abortion personally, I don't know if I ever want to be in a position to tell any two people what they should be doing with their situation. My preference would be for them not to have an abortion. That's my personal preference. But I've always took the position of who am I to tell somebody what they should be doing in their circumstance based on their, whether it be their ability to raise the kid, take care of the child. That's not my position. Where one place that me and Latrice agree on, this didn't come up on Saturday because we wasn't having an abortion debate. We were talking about, you know, what we talk about after the fact. But one place I also know she's agreed with me on from a previous show was I've always believed both people should be included in that decision. It shouldn't be just a singular decision or whatever on whether they have an abortion or not. And where she and I agree is if the guy says he wanted and she doesn't, then he could choose to be a single father if he chooses versus her just, you know, aborting the baby. You know, unfortunately, you know, even she has to carry it. So that's where her and I agree. But again, that was able to have a nuanced dialogue when we were having the conversations strictly about abortion. But I consider this forced birth part, this term from a diversity consultant, I'm challenging her, and I call it BS because it's more natural to have the child. So forced death is a better term than forced birth. And I'm offering that because there is an ideological fight, the narrative of adopting the term forced birth is a fancy word, a misnomer of a word to challenge for those who are advocates for abortions, but it's actually forced deaths when we're choosing to kill a child. That's what it actually is. So I don't like that y'all are adopting this term forced birth. Go ahead, Latrice.
Okay, so first of all, it's not a child, it's a fetus. So that's the first.
You're breaking up again. It went good. Oh, can you hear her?
She choppy. She choppy.
You real choppy, so we can't hear you.
Oh, she choppy.
You want me to again?
Yeah, just try
one more
again.
time.
Like when you click the whatever you did before.
I'm gonna leave it back in.
Yeah, try it again. Try it again. But you see kind of where I'm going with this?
Oh, for sure. I'm ready for it. I'm ready.
So I let it back in, but I'm just saying,
I just
I
got my
realized
pop.
3 hours after the show, I let it get away with that.
Bro, you just stepped all in it now. I'm just ready. I'm just a spectator.
I'm all the way in it, man.
I'm a spectator at this point. I got my popcorn.
Yeah, for sure. But it was 3 hours later because she kept saying it on the show, and it wasn't sitting with me right. But our dialogue wasn't about whether we agree or disagree with it, right?
Yeah.
I let her rock with it, but at 3 o'clock after my show, I was like, man, I should have checked her for this.
No, she the right one. I can see she got that emotional intelligence. So I really want to hear what her, you know, but yeah,
Go ahead. So let's see if we can hear you now, Queen. Go ahead.
Yeah,
we can hear you a little better. It's still choppy. I don't know why.
Now what? I'm
bad.
laptop.
Yeah, try something new because we
All
can't
right.
hear you for whatever reason. Your laptop is always better.
yeah, laptops. It's probably the
Especially
connection.
StreamYard prefers laptop over phone. Too.
Yeah, it's probably the data. The data's
Yeah.
kind of is feeding it.
But yeah, this is what she does for a living. So I'm interested in hearing her because I didn't give her no challenge. You know, because on the show, you know me, I challenge you. You know, so sometimes I challenge you just for the sake of challenge you. But she slipped that one by me because I had never heard it that way before.
I mean, I get what you're saying with the forced burst. It's an oxymoron, is what it is. Because
exactly.
Yeah, it's kind of that it's wordplay for sure, because it's like forced births as opposed to what? Forced deaths? Like, you know what I mean? It did.
So this is an example of what I was talking about earlier. So when you're trying to control the narrative and not have true dialogue,
right?
I gotta let her know. Hopefully she'll jump on and hear this part. I'll say it again to her. But now I don't think you're leading with trying to have dialogue. You feel me? Because this is such a touchy issue over, you know, whether this thing is getting turned over or not. So I know one side is willing to not play fair, and I'm saying forced birth is definitely a term that's not playing fair.
But see, in defense of what she's saying, that's part of the debate skills.
Yeah, that's real.
Because part of the debate skills is to present it in a way that it makes sense to the person or the people that you're trying to sway to make the right decision. So there's no right or wrong in that. It's part of.
Tracy, let's see if we hear you now, Queen. Let's give another.
Is this better?
Way better. Go ahead.
That's a lot better.
All right. So what I was saying was, at first, it's not a baby; it's a fetus. It cannot sustain life outside of the mother's womb. I call it forced birth because if a woman wants to have an abortion, but the right has been taken away from her, then the government is forcing her to carry that baby to term and to give birth. If it were pro-life, then universal health care would be provided for her, sufficient education, sufficient housing and food. And these are sufficient wages. These are things that the government is consistently fighting against, but yet they want to force a woman who gets pregnant to carry a baby to term and then be born into a world where she may not be able to effectively sustain her. But I use words intentionally. And so the reason that I used forced birth is because the government is removing the woman's right to choose what to do with her body, therefore forcing her to give birth.
Not true.
Yes, it is.
Go ahead, William. Go ahead.
I just want to make a point with what she said, though, because the topic is, right? The topic is, I want to kind of stay to the topic a little bit instead of getting off into the nuances of the abortion, which we could definitely go in that. So keep your thought, Montoya. But what she said is, I use that word very intentionally, right? And the way that Ms. Latrice presented it was the way that you debate. It's the way that you have public discourse. If we're talking about public discourse, it is to be creative in your choice of words in the way that you're going to make it happen, right?
Make it most effective.
Yeah, I was the captain of my debate team.
Right, exactly. That's fundamentals. That's the fundamentals that I was talking about. That's fundamentally sound thought before you speak, right?
And here's what I love about what you're pointing out, William, and this is the beauty of this show. So the beauty of this moment and you pointing that out, I disagree with her vehemently right now, but also can receive the brilliance in using the term. Because again, on Saturday, it's slipping by me because I've talked about abortion throughout my life. I've never heard the term forced birth, right? And like I said, at one point on the show, it caught me. I was like, you keep using this term, but I didn't even know what to do with it.
And what did it stay with you after the show?
Well, that's what I'm telling you. It took 3 hours later, I finally got it right here.
Then it did what it was supposed to do.
So it was very, so what I'm saying is I'm giving credit.
One more question.
Go ahead.
Did she raise her voice any at all?
Not at all. It's brilliant. It was brilliant.
There you go.
Right. So the beauty of this discourse, right? While I disagree with her with a lack of emotional intelligence, right? The typical dialogue will just tell her how much I disagree with her. And I just was telling you when you were when you were getting back on the trees, I was telling William, which is proving my point, which again, to his point, is the skill of dialogue and the skill of discourse. I was like, she's using that term. And that's what I said to him. I says, and that speaks to what I was talking about. Now you're going to manipulate the side into what your agenda is. And he goes, that's very effective. And you intentionally use it. So,
but I didn't manipulate. I used definitions properly.
I agree.
No, it's not properly.
I agree, Montoya.
It is a natural birth. And if you left alone, the baby probably
it is a natural birth that is being forced upon a woman who wanted an abortion.
But here it is.
Hence the term forced birth.
No, it is a forced death. Abortion is a forced death then.
An abortion is not a death.
It is a
It's
forced.
the ending of a pregnancy. It's an aborting of a fetus, not a baby. It's not a baby if it
But what
can't
naturally happens
not.
is this child, in more cases than not, will be born. This is what would naturally happen. Again, I hear what you're doing, but based on the reality of the conversation we were actually having on Saturday, the reality is men and women can choose not to have children every day. So she can choose not to have a child and have to even consider an abortion.
No. So I didn't say forced pregnancy. I was intentional. I didn't say forced pregnancy.
Montoya, you already stepped in it because you can't hear what she's doing.
I hear it. That's why we're having this dialogue.
No. You ain't following me.
Okay,
you can't hear what she's doing. You can only hear what she's saying.
No, I'm concerned about
no. You understand what I'm saying, though.
Okay, let me follow. I'm missing. I don't mind. Hey,
this is the debate. This is not so. Because if I was her, I'd say, no, brother. You need to hear what I'm saying, not hear what I'm doing, because I'm not doing anything. This is what I'm saying. You understand?
And I'm not using.
So you're putting it back into this. You're putting it back into the manipulation, right? So where she says, I'm not manipulating, I'm using words. So this is what I'm saying, not what I'm doing. Does that make sense? Because you still, in a way, you're still saying she's manipulating in that way where really it's just the words that she's saying. How you perceive them is on you.
And you're adding the nuance, not me. I'm using words as they're clearly defined. You're adding.
You say clearly defined where you're choosing to put forced in front of, but I can.
I had a right that is being taken away.
Why do you say you have a right?
Now forced to do something that I don't want to do.
Don't get pregnant.
It's the idea of
I didn't say forced pregnancy though, Montoya. I said forced birth.
Right. So then I say forced death.
But it's not death because it's not alive.
Abortion is a forced death.
It's not alive. How can you kill something that's not alive? It can't sustain itself outside of the mother's womb.
Man, she was the debate captain.
No. What happens is
she debate.
That's fair. So now, if you want to get into the ultimate debate, we've had those dialogues about how far it can go in the different months, and there's always been those variations. Of course, those who are against abortion from a legal standpoint, and that's not necessarily. I told you already, that's not necessarily my position because that's two people's decision. So that's not my position. But of course, that dialogue gets into, well, we're going to do it up to this amount of weeks and up to this amount of weeks. And so at times there have been places where would you also be an advocate, to ask you this question, Latrice, would you also be an advocate of late-term abortions, which some people are? So are you putting yourself as that I'm not in that position? Because some people, because I'm not trying to ask you, I'm not trying to put you in a category. I'm asking, where do you land for those who are advocates even to late term? Maybe you're not that for your comment to stand. Because we just talk about it in general.
I'm not an advocate of abortion if a fetus has reached that state where it's viable, which is typically 24 weeks.
24 weeks.
Based on her explanation, so now that she has done what we talk about, it's public discourse, right? So for me, and this is me as the audience, right? So when Montoya comes to me and he says, I don't understand, like when you were gone, and he was like, I don't understand the word forced birth. It doesn't sit with me well because it's like that as opposed to what, and I go, yeah. I'm like, yeah, that is kind of weird that it would be put that way, right? But then when Latrice comes back and she explains using the data correctly in regards to when a fetus is a viable life versus when it isn't, and then connects that to the terminology that she's using, it for me, I'm the type of person is make it make sense to me. I'm not trying to be emotional about it and say I agree or disagree with you. If it makes sense, it makes sense. Right? You know what I'm saying? And I think that's what we have to also understand from a intellectual standpoint when we're trying to receive the information. Because if we get caught up on the nuance of, I'm just not in favor of it, right? Then you stop listening to the actual thing that she's saying, which is all fact. She's not saying anything that she what she's saying right now, she could say, this is totally no emotion of mine. This is what I understand the fact of what science has said to be. And honestly, I'm calling it what it is.
And honestly, I could actually be pro-life and still believe, just based on the objective facts, that it would still be a forced birth if the woman's right to choose was taken away.
And that's what I'm hearing. That's what I'm hearing. So it ain't even about Latrice. It ain't even about Latrice.
Why do we call it right to choose? And the reason I'm asking that question is because while we understand that, humans to a degree have always figured out how to perform some forms of abortion throughout the world, throughout history, or whatever. Right. Then obviously, when it got in countries in which it got legalized, then it would kind of, in a sense, came under proper care, which is always the hope, right? That you're doing it in, under proper care versus some type of dangerous care, right? So I'm not naive to the fact that there have been women, in a sense, who have decided for whatever reason to even risk a dangerous abortion. So I'm not naive to that. But culturally, as humans, conceptually, that hasn't been the large majority of, in a sense, what happened prior to this quote unquote becoming a right. And unfortunately, where even, here where you and I disagree, you and I agree, is unfortunately, as it became a right in this country in particular, it did not include both parties. So that's what confuses me on this linear right to choose.
So let me explain it to you this way. In a sense, you could actually look at it that women won't be full citizens, because presently, women, if Roe v. Wade is repealed, women will only be allowed to maintain control of 4 of their top 5 bodily systems, whereas men will still be allowed to maintain control over all 5. How
are you not in control of getting pregnant? I don't get. That's what loses me. You're
so the thing is, you're getting confused because I didn't call it forced pregnancy. You can get pregnant, but presently, a woman has the right to choose whether she wants to see that pregnancy to term and then give birth to a child.
Why does she choose before she gets pregnant?
But that's not up for debate here. That's not what we're debating. You're debating the term forced birth. I gave you the definition.
Okay, that's fair. Okay, that's what you're saying. So you talk about the term itself. Okay.
Right, because no man is forced to reproduce. A woman would be forced to carry that baby to term. So it's a different dialogue entirely when we want to talk about being responsible in sex. That's not the dialogue.
That should be the dialogue under the.
But that's not the dialogue that you presented to me.
That's not the forced births.
Right. That's an entirely different dialogue altogether. You wanted to discuss why I use the term forced birth.
She's right. It's not.
How is it forced when it's natural?
Because a woman is right to choose not to carry that baby to term is being taken away. Death. No, it's not a forced death.
Yes, it is. What would happen next?
Because an abortion is performed before that fetus is viable, which means that it's not a living being. It is a fetus.
Right. So I'm going to call an abortion a forced death of a fetus.
You can call it that, but definition-wise, it's still incorrect because a fetus, you can't kill what's not alive.
Forced birth. I'm calling them forced death.
How can you kill what's not alive, Montoya?
And I think if I may, I think you have to. I think the word force, like how are we? Well,
I'm saying force because
when you say force,
naturally,
is it force? Is it forced in regards to, because I hear force being used in different aspects, right? So is it forced in the way that you're forcing? Because if you think about forcing, they're not the way that it is now. Roe versus Wade today, there is no force. It's a choice. So you can't use force the way it is today because there is no force. There's choice.
Right. And a woman can choose to carry a pregnancy to term and give birth to a baby, or she can choose to abort the fetus.
So in that aspect, Montoya, you're saying the forced behavior is you're forcing the end of the the pregnancy physically, not from a decision. And that's what I'm saying. The word
you have to go in and medically force.
Yeah, medically forcing end. So medically, you're forcing the end of a pregnancy. Right. Medically, you're forcing the end of a pregnancy, but you're not forcing a woman to make a decision. So when we talk about force, what part of force are we talking about? Because what Latrice is talking about is forcing the woman to make a decision. What you're talking about is forcing the pregnancy to end in terms of the physical medical aspect of it. That's two different. That's not the same. Well, based on the way it is today.
I'm effectively using force definitely.
But it's not. So you're arguing. It's not negating my definition of force, because when you take away that person's right to choose, you're then forcing them down a path that they may not have desired to go down.
See, that's
that means forcing a birth.
So we've taken that right away from the man always.
How have we taken the man doesn't reproduce?
No, we've taken the right away from him to choose.
Choose what?
To choose if he wants a child or not. He has
no choice. So while I do, so let me explain something. So while I do agree that a man should have a part of that decision, that's from an emotional perspective, but it's a woman's body. She's the one whose life is in peril when she gets on that table and goes to deliver that child. And therefore, it should be her right ultimately to choose whether she wants to do that or not. And when you take her right to choose away, you're forcing her to deliver a baby that she may not have wanted to deliver.
If she didn't want to deliver it.
That's a different conversation now.
I don't understand. I'm confused.
See, part of being on a debate team, you got to stay on topic.
You got me on that. I'll take that. I'll take that L all day.
Look, I'm the judge. And so, order in the court. Yep.
Hey, I'll take the L on the debate and willingly admit my lack of emotional intelligence will not allow me to understand her position.
You know what you need right now? You need a 15-minute recess. Your Honor, I need a 15-minute recess.
Montoya, I don't know if I've told you this, but I didn't get a job once because they said I wasn't emotional enough.
Yeah, that's foul.
I can dig it.
They said that with a client, I may not be able to express excitement and whatever with working with clients, so I didn't get a job.
So you weren't working with children. You weren't working with children.
Oh no.
Okay, so yeah, I don't understand.
No, I know my lane, and it's not little people. I taught Sunday school one time, and I left traumatized. So no.
So well, with that said, you're gonna keep rocking with forced birth.
I am.
You intelligently argued why. And William has already decided that you're still in your lane with that. Then my turn, William, not on topic, is force.
Come on, man.
I'm also certified in emotional intelligence, so I can schedule your training class if you like.
Look, this ain't the Montoya I know. He don't never sound. I ain't never heard him sound defeated. Never.
She knows. I accept the one I give him. That's what people don't know. Latrice knows I'll take my L's like a man.
And I take my L's with Montoya too. He's convinced me a few times.
Yeah, that's the whole public discourse. Right.
And that was
when you can publicly take that L. Like this is what point I want to make. The maturity, the maturation is being able to publicly take that L. When we get to that point, we've arrived.
Right, and that leads to discourse that leads to policy. Because sometimes policies that have been wrong in the past have changed because the public discourse was able to change it. The fear, and I'm gonna end this show, the fear of me doing this show, I was like, I'm just gonna do this unique show, even though it probably doesn't matter to people. I don't know if you saw at the beginning, I was thinking about using LeBron and Jordan just to draw more people. And I was like, well, I don't want to be not true to who we are, right? And so I'm like, Bird and Magic. The reason I used it is because you come from that era, and I was highlighting at the beginning of this dialogue, even a Bird Magic argument back in the day. It may be me romanticizing how I remember those arguments, but when you about to speak to this, would be a good way to close. But I remember that those dialogues, when you would get somebody, most of our neighborhood, we love Magic for the most part, right? But when you would hear a Bird dialogue, somebody that says they're on Bird, whatever, they like Boston or whatever, they would bring you his actual stats that you would at least have to consider. Because here's what would happen at the end of those debates that I feel like doesn't happen today. What would happen at a Bird, and this is how I remember, at the end of a Bird Magic debate in the 80s, late 80s, mid 80s, whatever the case may be, is even when they still walked away on their same sides, people that still love Magic out of the barbershop, right? People that still love Boston, they both would walk out saying, that's a bad boy.
Yeah.
Like Magic fans
Respect.
walked out and said, Bird a bad boy, even though they still rocking with Magic. And the Bird fans had to give it up to Magic. Today, you have a LeBron, Michael Jordan debate. You actually think LeBron trash. Like they walk away from the dialogue as if LeBron is trash.
Yeah, yeah.
And then vice versa, the younger generation who hadn't seen Jordan play just literally won't even consider what you're saying at all. So there is no discourse when I won't even consider. Again, the sports analogy is doesn't matter in life. But
again,
when we bring the same concept to things that matter, such as discourse like this, right? And Latrice is saying, hey, here's the side I'm on. We're battling Roe Wade. And you're able to take what I said and put it out of context, and I accept that. Then if I want to go against her, I either go back to the drawing board versus what I would do now is just try to get you on my side, and we would yell her down. That's how dialogue happens now. If I would try to take our friendship with you, you've been knowing me for years, and act like you're supposed to be on my side and just yell her down, even though we're out of line of what the conversation is. That's how this conversation would have went if we didn't have the ability to have discourse amongst us three.
The reason why I like the analogy so much with sports, right, is because, and I don't know Latrice's background. Montoya, I don't really know your background, like specific, like how you were raised and all that stuff, but it's all fundamentals. It's fundamentals, like that ability to stay emotionally intelligent, stick to the topic, defend your position, right? State your objective and stay to that, just like she did. Just like she did a perfect presentation of, no, that's not what we're talking about. You're arguing a different point. Like, you know what I mean? And that is fundamentals. You have to exercise that. You have to practice that. You have to that's very few times that comes as a natural behavior, right? So that stuff you're seeing at the barbershop where people get overly emotional and think somebody's trash, and that's because there's no fundamental practice of that skill set of debating and understanding how to do
let me
it
jump in. So
in the proper context.
Our education system coming from going back all the way down to the great debaters, right?
What education?
Critical thinking was a big part of discourse all the way relatively, I would say strongly through the 70s, started getting a little weaker in the 80s. Now, what you see, even at the university level, is very lack of the ability to have a critical dialogue. So even if the quote unquote 38% who are college educated in this country are not even doing it at the higher learning level, we're watching that public discourse lead to a president who can't even talk well. You understand what I'm saying?
But you know what, Montoya?
Me just highlighting that part of, not saying which side I'm on for anybody out there watching. I'm a political independent, but I am highlighting there was a time where you had to at least speak well, something that's always been put on black people, right? But you have to at least speak well. But with those things not going together, now it's just I can get in the echo chamber and out yell you. Go ahead, Latrice. I'll give you that.
Speaking of the echo chamber, one thing with debate, when you're on a debate team, you have to learn the entire topic, both sides, because when you go to a debate meet, you don't know which side you're going to draw. So you have to be able to argue either side.
Right.
And that if you understand both sides of an issue, then you're able to effectively articulate a perspective because you understand where that other side is coming from. And when I talk about diversity issues, like I have to read some crazy stuff. But when I talk about diversity issues, I have to understand those people who are against women's equity, who are against racial equity, who are against LGBTQ plus rights, because if I don't, then I can't articulate effectively why they should have these rights if I don't know what perspective they're going to come from why they shouldn't have these rights.
Amen.
Makes sense. And let me highlight this, and now we're gone. I'm looking to get the Mental Dialogue Live experience back started. And we have this cool thing. I wish it was in Atlanta, William. I do this every night. I do this one called Counter Argument. And it's literally, Latrice kills this one every time she does it. But it's basically, I'll take topics from the Mental Dialogue talk show that has two sides to them, and then we'll select one. And when you come up, we'll flip a coin. You figure out which side you're on. You got 2 minutes to debate it. So that's one of our best Mental Dialogue Live experiences.
Bro, that's the fundamentals. That's the exercises we need.
We practice it. The pandemic shut us down, but we got to come back with it.
We need those exercises, bro. The younger generation needs those critical thinking exercises so they can really understand the topic and really argue it and really stay. You're not going to get that. That doesn't just come through osmosis, bro. That comes through fundamental training, practice, reinforcement, and we don't do that no more, right? That's why I love what you do, like the live experience, because that's what y'all do. But we got to get the younger people, because the only way we're going to change and the only way we're going to be more effective as Black people is we got to get the younger kids, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? That age, to think that way. Because by the time you get to 20, 25, 30, it's a wrap, son. You ain't changing how people think or behave. Or
that's real.
25.
And again, where this matters most, I hope nobody's hearing, the goal is not about winning a debate. It's about the ability to take in information and give consideration, because we should actually be doing debates because we must live together. We must decide to live in this country together. We may have laws locally, nationally that matter to us. And so while I can come in on the side, our ultimate goal should be, how do we move forward together? So let me consider how I give a little bit of what you need. How do you get what you need? Or sometimes you find out your position is completely wrong and not viable. But the only way you can do that is with this skill set. So for anybody listening, we're not trying to teach you how to win a debate. We're trying to teach you how to use critical thinking that will serve you in your own life, on the decisions you need to make for your family, despite what the political narrative or the media is telling you. Ultimately, thinking for yourself will lead to your own solutions. That's why it ultimately matters over everything. And that's it, y'all. Just my 3 cents. See y'all next week. Thank you, William and Latrice, for coming on. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, Montoya.
Thanks.
Yeah. I loved it. I enjoyed it.
Me too.
Appreciate you.
All right. Peace, y'all.
All right. Bye.